Good morning from Washington, D.C. My name is Shelby Magid, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Thank you all for joining us today, and I want to give a special thank you to our co-hosting organization, Civic Hub, especially Yuri Lutsenko, who helped us put this together. We've got an excellent panel lined up for you today. The event is titled Aggressor on the United Nations Security Council. What does it mean for the world? I'm joined by the founder of Civic Hub, Maxim Baryshnikov, as well as a member of Ukrainian Parliament, Alexei Zhmerznetsky. We've got an excellent Ukrainian diplomat who served as Ukraine's ambassador to the US and the UN, Ambassador Volodymyr Yelchenko, and two distinguished international lawyers, Thomas Grant, a senior fellow at the Lauterpacht Center for International Law at the University of Cambridge, and Sir Geoffrey Nice, a British barrister, judge, and former prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Near the end of the event, we'll be joined by another member of Ukraine's parliament, Lesia Vasylenko. We're going to begin now with a presentation from Max and then turn to the panel discussion before we open it up to audience Q&A. Please feel welcome to drop your questions in the Q&A at any time. And now, Max, over to you.
Thank you all our participants. Thank you for a great opportunity. Well, we'll start with a small and quick, I hope, presentation. Aggressor on the United Nations Security Council. What does it mean for the world? I should say, next, please. I should say that I'm here as a co-founder of Civic Hub Initiative Group, Expel Russia Out of the United Nations. And we are, as a group, next, please. As a group, we established in 2022, unites international professionals and experts from all over the world, aims to stop the war in Ukraine and for sure punish aggressors. We are absolutely non-government and non-profit, unfortunately, organization as a civil initiative, open to discussion and cooperation anytime with any specialists, any experts, and we are independent, non-political, and non-party affiliated. It's very important for us. And for sure, we concentrating on purely legal matters of United Nations activity and replacement of Russian Federation, and question how they get there and what to do to restore justice in United Nations and throughout the world. Please, next, please. You can see the moment of sign of United Nations Charter that took place in 1945. By the way, Ukraine, as a former Ukraine Soviet Republic, ratified this charter in 1945 year, and Russian Federation and before RSFSR never signed and ratified this United Nations Charter. Next, please. So, according to this charter, to become a member state, any country should be or having participated in the United Nations Conference on International Organization in San Francisco, no. For Russian Federation, having previously signed the declaration by United Nations, no for Russian Federation, or signed the present charter and ratified in accordance with Article 110 of United Nations Charter, also not Russian Federation. Next, please. Yeah, next, please. Yeah, Article 4. To become a member state of the United Nations, membership open to all peace-loving states, and the admission of any such state to membership of the United Nations will be affected by a decision of General Assembly. So Russian Federation has never get such decision of General Assembly, never get a decision of Security Council to support such membership at all. Next, please. And ratification of the United Nations Charter. Each country of membership ratified this charter, except Russian Federation. So what to do? A lot of lawyers, a lot of politics throughout the world ask our initiative group a simple question. Okay, problem is, and we agree with you, legal position, but what to do? So our initiative group, Civic Hub, kick Russia out of the United Nations, prepared three basic scenarios that based just on United Nations Charter articles and already existed precedent or in the United Nations. First of all, it's so-called Yugoslavia variant, Chinese case, and South Africa case. As a rule, we based on Chinese case because it will take 10 years for sure, and two General Assembly decision, 1961 and 1971, but it needs just ordinary majority of countries, and so it can be done even if one or few states from Security Council are against this decision. Next, please. So it is possible, but what is the ideal solution? As for us, yes, it's no legal arguments against. I can say a few words, if I can, about Estopel argument. It's absolutely null argument, but it is. Need just ordinary majority in the United Nations General Assembly, provide responsibility for aggression and reparation based on international law, not in some kind of ad hoc tribunals, and for sure fulfillment of the United Nations Security Council permanent member by Ukraine until the United Nations Charter will reform. We all good know that Article 23 of United Nations Charter consists no such country as Russian Federation. Also, no such country as People Republic of China. But how China, for now, absolutely legal, represent itself in United Nations and United Nations Security Council? It's easy. We call it a Chinese variant. Next, please. So, what Ukraine really deserves? First of all, suspension of Russian Federation delegation credentials. Second, investigation of USSR seat replacement. It's absolutely legal. It was absolutely legal as for us. And interpretation of Almaty NIS head of state's 1991 decision. What means this decision at all? And also United Nations Charter binding obligatory for Russian Federation graduation. Next, please. And what Ukraine and the rest of the world really needs from the United Nations? Well, few things. First of all, expel Russia Federation from the United Nations General Assembly and United Nations Security Council permanent member seat, global change in the geopolitical situation in Eastern Europe, punishment of aggression, and for sure, reparation payment. Next, please. And one more, next, please. So we propose the simple way how to do it and hope that if we will support it by many other countries throughout the world, we will get a resolution in the United Nations General Assembly, and justice and peace, justice for Ukraine and peace for all the world will be again the main idea of United Nations as co-founders of this biggest organization in the world put in the text of United Nations Charter articles. Anyway, next, please. We'll have an opportunity to speak about. You can see our link for our petition. Already more than 320,000 people already support us and sign this petition. And next, please. And one more, please. Next. You can see the links to different materials that I talk about that consist original documents from 1991, from 1946 and other. And you can find a lot of interest in regarding replacement of Soviet Union in the United Nations and United Nations Security Council. Thank you in advance, and I hope I will have a lot of questions about our today's topics, and I will participate trying to answer some of them. Thank you.
Max, thank you so much. That was very thorough and efficient, so I appreciate it. I will now turn to all of our panelists with questions. And again, any audience members that have questions, you can put that in the Q&A chat. I'd like to turn to you first, Thomas Grant. You are among the most widely cited writers and thinkers on international law, so I need to ask you a fundamental and hard question. Is it actually realistic to talk about removing Russia from the UN Security Council and question Russia's presence at the UN? Why do so many legal experts say this is impossible? Is that a legal reaction or political?
Shelby, thank you very much. Thank you to the Atlantic Council too, and to Civic Hub for convening this really excellent group to talk about this really important problem. For any decision to be reached in any sort of institution, whether you're talking about the United States Congress, the British Parliament, or the United Nations, or any parliamentary assembly or other institution, you have to ask, is there a lawful path, a legal procedural pathway to do what you wish to do? And is there a political critical mass sufficient to do what you wish to do? Those are distinct questions. You have to take them one at a time. There are times when a political proposition is simply so unrealistic that really you shouldn't waste time with the lawyers trying to figure out the procedure and the law. And there are times when the procedure and the law is so obviously against you that there's no sense in talking to the politicians to determine whether a political critical mass exists. My assessment is that neither of those situations obtains right now with respect to removing or at least suspending the participation of Russia in the Security Council. In other words, a procedural pathway exists. So the answer to the lawyer's question, strictly from a legal standpoint and a precedential standpoint, is it's absolutely possible. The United Nations has twice practically suspended the participatory privileges of member states of the UN. That was in 1956, when Hungary had been invaded by the Soviet Union and its government was forcibly replaced. General Assembly, for all intents and purposes, prevented Hungary from representing itself at the UN, and that went on for 3 years, 1956, 57, and 58. And in 1974, after the UN had admonished apartheid South Africa to end apartheid, but year in and year out, South Africa refused. Finally, in 1974, the United Nations, for practical purposes, prevented South Africa from participating in the UN. Now, both Hungary and South Africa continued to be member states, but their participatory access was de facto suspended for a period. Now, that's simply part of the constitutional history of the United Nations, kind of open and shut case. It can be done from a procedural and a lawyer's standpoint. The Security Council has its own rules of procedure, which are somewhat different in form from the procedures of the General Assembly, but substantively, the question of the credentials of a member's representative to represent that member in the Security Council are subject to an objection procedure. Now, in fact, the Security Council has never had occasion to pass judgment on an objection. Nobody's ever objected to a council member in the council sitting there. But under Rule 17 of the rules of procedure that govern the council, the rules in force today, objection may be voiced by any member. And if objection is voiced, then the council shall make a determination of procedure whether to seat the representative of the country to whom objection was raised. Because it's a procedural objection, there's no veto. It's a 9-state majority that would uphold the objection. Now, we get to the political question. If we were looking at a Security Council composition that, let us say, had the 5 permanent members plus Russia's 10 best friends in the world. Well, actually, there aren't even 10, but let us imagine you had 10 North Koreas and Cubas and Venezuelas. Now, at that point, I think we would have to concede that politically it's a non-starter. But today, the composition of the Security Council does not lean so heavily in Russia's favor. To the contrary, we have, depending exactly how you count, 9 or 10 certified friends of Ukraine. I measure that by the voting records of the current members of the council in the General Assembly, where we now have had a number of pro-Ukraine, very strong resolutions under the Uniting for Peace procedure, where the Assembly convenes in emergency special session, so not an ordinary session. Bear in mind, a year ago, right now, it had been 40 years since the General Assembly had last convened a fresh emergency session. So it's an extraordinary thing. It's a special procedure. And in that framework, you've got a solid group of states in the council who have voted in favor of the pro-Ukraine resolutions every time. These are the, well, so that's a political background to, I think, illustrate that this is not beyond the realm of the possible. Now, is it easy? Would it be very easy to get 9 countries in the council to take this step? Of course not. It's a big step. But what we've heard from Maxime and his colleagues is that we are facing an extraordinary set of circumstances. You have to look at the situation in the round. Now, it might be that we should reserve this for later parts of our discussion, but we're not dealing with a run-of-the-mill violation of international law, or even a merely serious violation. What we're looking at is an unprecedented assault against the principles and purposes of the United Nations. And in 1945 was a time when it was fresh in everybody's mind that in the preceding 30 or 40 years, and you might add in the preceding 300 or 400 years, time and time again, major breakdowns of international order had erupted out of territorial claim. Wasn't the only reason countries had wars, but it was a really, really important driver of international armed conflict, including the worst armed conflicts of the last several hundred years. So in 1945, if nothing else were accomplished, the UN could still be proud of having presided over a 70-odd year period, 1945, I'd say to 2014, when there was scarcely any attempt by one state to overthrow the established territorial order with another state. That's why Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait and declaration that he was destroying and erasing Kuwait was such a radical breakdown, and why the world united to reverse that aggression. It's at that level that we have to think about what Russia has done since 2014, but then with the all-out invasion last year. It's a declaration to overthrow borders, erase an entire country from the map. And that makes the aggression a really unique assault against international order. And that's why
Absolutely.
you know, making the case politically after you express the legal.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
Yes, so I think, thank you for that very useful answer. I'd love to send that to some of the people that say it's just impossible. You've set us up well for the next question of saying that this is not outside of the realm of possibility and talking about the seriousness and extreme nature of these violations. With that, I'd like to turn to Ambassador Yelchenko, going along the lines of how extreme this is and also along the line of a reality check. I'd like to hear from your perspective as an experienced diplomat who served at the UN. If the UN does not change Russia's role, is the institution, or at least the international belief in its effectiveness, at risk of becoming irrelevant or dangerously undermined? What do you think?
By the way, can I interrupt to say, statistically, I think it unlikely that 6 people of a 12-party conference can have really good reasons for not being seen. It's much better for all of us if we are visible one to the other. And I'm looking forward to seeing Yuri when he speaks.
Ambassador Yelchenko.
Okay, thank you for your question. Let me start from saying this. Today is the 1st of March. In Ukraine, this is the first day of spring. And this is very symbolic that we have this conference right now, because you remember 1 year ago, Russia said that they would take Kyiv in 3 days. Later, then they said that they will freeze Ukrainians and Ukraine to death by destroying our energy infrastructure, which never happened. So it makes our topic today even more relevant. Now, well, straight to the topic. I see a lot of merit in the title of our conference, Aggressor at the UN Security Council. I think that back in 1945, the founding fathers of the United Nations could never imagine, even in their worst dreams, that one of the countries which they included into the P5 with veto right, the permanent members of the Security Council, the main principal organ of the United Nations, having the main responsibility for preserving peace and security in the world, that one of those 5 would become an aggressor. And this makes the issue of expelling Russia from the United Nations in general, and automatically from the UN Security Council. And I want to stress this because many people who are not experts on the issue, they divide these two questions. They talk about expelling Russia from the UN Security Council, or leaving it without veto right, which is non-realistic. First, secondly, this is not correct, from the principal point of view that Russia should be, in general, expelled from the United Nations. As Maxim said rightly, it has obtained its membership, totally unlegally. I'm not going to go into the history of December of 1991. Probably other speakers will say a few words about that, but any lawyer in the world, be it international or national lawyer, would say that it was done illegally. It was not done according to the UN Charter, according to the rules and principles of international law. That's why I'm standing on the side of applying the purely legal approach to this issue, because, and now let me elaborate a little bit on the issue and on your question. Yes, there are 3 or 4 options or ways of doing it. The first is purely political. The General Assembly sits down and expelling Russia from the UN, which is non-realistic because you need 2/3 of votes. Then you need the approval of the Security Council, which is not realistic because Russia has a veto right. You can, go the other way around by reforming the UN Charter, which is even less realistic because, in addition to those two conditions, you would also need the ratification by all 193 parliaments of the amendments or of the new charter. The second way is so-called Chinese model, which is, it looks okay, but in this case, Ukraine should stand up and apply for the Security Council membership in the place of Russia, which we don't pretend, and it's not our aim, our goal. And the third is the combination of, Yugoslavian or South African model. I would call it the political legal approach, because in addition to the procedure which will not require two-thirds majority in the General Assembly, and it would not require the application of the veto right, because it will become the procedural issue if you go for that. And in addition to what Maxim has said, and Thomas, I would say that we can also explore the possibility of doing this through the UN Credentials Committee, or UN General Assembly Credentials Committee, which consists of only 9 states, including 3 permanent members of the Security Council, and the other 6 which are elected on the rotation basis. If you look at the current composition of the Credentials Committee, you will see that even without long study, you would easily have from 6 to 7 votes in favor of Ukrainian approach. And even if we don't apply it now, 1 year later, the composition will be different. But I think that it will still be much more possible to obtain the necessary majority of votes, simple majority in that committee. And then, as Thomas has rightly said, we can just endlessly prolong or extend this decision year after year, until the time comes when Russia will be totally expelled from the United Nations, or until the moment when Russia would change and become a normal state, or whatever will be in the place of the current Russian Federation. We don't know yet. And then, as in case with South Africa, we will have totally different country, the member of the United Nations, legally joining the UN, and then no lawyer would ever voice any objections against that. Now, speaking on the issue of the possibility, political possibility of doing that, even if you look at the composition of any Security Council of the UN, any 2 years of membership, we certainly have 3 out of 5 permanent members which will go for the Ukrainian approach. Not automatically, of course. We should work hard with the US, with the UK, with France, to obtain their support, their full support. We have China, yes. Many people would say that, look, Chinese position is much closer to the Russian Federation. China would never support this kind of decision. But first of all, given the precedent of how China obtained their own seat on the Security Council, I don't think that China would be actively opposing this. Secondly, China even now has much more interest in preserving the normal relationship, well, especially in the economic and financial fields, with the West, with the collective West, and not only with the United States and the European Union, but also Japan, Canada, Australia, other countries, other major countries of the world. And I don't think that China would go against the decision which would seem positive for those countries. I don't think that China would go along the Russian Federation approach just for the sake of supporting the Russian course. And let me also add one more thing.
One last comment.
Yeah, if you look at the pattern of the veto use in the Security Council during more than 75 years, you would see that China very rarely, only a very few times, applied its veto right individually. The last time China did it, if I'm correct, if my memory correct, was sometime in 1999 or 2000, when China blocked the decision to extend the UN peacekeeping operation in Macedonia, simply because Macedonia before that established diplomatic relations with Taiwan. In all other cases, in dozens of cases. China simply added its veto to the veto already applied by the Russian Federation. So the preference of Chinese foreign policy is always to be, under the line. China would never go against any major decision individually. So it will not support Russia if the vote of China would become critical. So this is my last point.
Thank you very much. That was extremely useful. As we've mentioned, Russia's crimes in Ukraine, I would like to turn to Alexei and bring in the aspect of justice efforts. Alexei, there have been strong calls from Ukrainian lawmakers and activists, as well as allies, for the establishment of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression. As a member of Ukrainian parliament, can you tell us what your role is in this initiative to both challenge Russia's role in the UN, and how does that connect to ongoing efforts for justice, including those to create a special tribunal?
Thank you very much, Shelby, for having me today and for these very important questions. Yes, I have answer for the rest of the speakers on this topic of excluding Russia from the UN. The very important thing that if none of the options to terminate the Russian Federation participation in UN Security Council voting are implemented, Russia will continue to veto any decisions that concern its responsibility. It paralyzes the ability of UN Security Council to hold Russian state and its leadership accountable for crimes of aggression. Collection of reparations or confiscation of Russia assets require court verdicts of a supranational and highest level of force. As you know, the decisions of the Security Council are binding, but unfortunately not the decisions of the General Assembly. The most powerful countries in the West avoid taking the actions that would challenge the inviolability of private property rights within their own jurisdiction. So it's unlikely that US or other Western countries would implement international decisions on reparations or confiscations without the specific authorizations of the UN Security Council. And the possibility of such decisions at the national level of the states is even less. Furthermore, the presence of the Russian Federation in the UN Security Council also makes it more difficult to the UN international ICC, to the UN International Criminal Court, to consider cases related to the crimes of aggression, as well as for the establishment of the special tribunal under the auspices of the UN Security Council. And consequently, expelling Russia from the UN Security Council is essential to ensure that the court decisions, any court decisions of the international level to punish the Russia state and their leadership will be implemented by all countries over the world and even our Western partners. And that's why the expelling Russia from the UN is crucial for this.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Alexei. Now, Sir Jeffrey, I'd love to turn to you. As a former prosecutor of the ICTY, what lessons do you bring from your past work to these current initiatives? And do you see the special tribunal as the best path forward for Ukraine's justice efforts? And we've got you muted. If you could just unmute. Thank you very much.
I'm not sure how much of my experience is relevant. My overall activities of the last 20 odd years has perhaps made me slightly better informed than the ordinary citizen. And I think the ordinary citizen is the person whose view we really need to have in mind, because the ordinary, I don't like the word ordinary, the non-specialist citizen has a completely mistaken understanding that there is a world order whereby bad things are dealt with. We all know, because we've got steeped in this stuff, that there is no such world order. There are thousands of rights obtained that should be enjoyed by citizens in countries at war, in countries being persecuted by their own governments, that those rights are broadly not defended by the world order, and that those who commit crimes against their own citizens or against the citizens of another country with which they're at war, all those rights are not defended, save just occasionally by a little bit of peace here and there, and that's it. And I think the time has probably come when we want to have regard to the level of understanding of the ordinary citizen. And I mention that because when you look at, I think, Thomas Grant's presentation, with all of which I agree and on which, of course, I cannot improve, his idea of a suspension being procedural, as I understand it, not if I've got this right, Thomas, procedural and therefore not being subject to the veto, does open up an opportunity to rely on the power of the non-specialist citizen, I think. Because if such an issue were raised, and especially if it were raised in conjunction with substantial public relations exercises through such ghastly newspapers as the Daily Mail in England and the equivalent in the United States, challenging their own governments about whether the government is going to support Russia in the United Nations having a veto on the Security Council, I think governments would find it quite difficult to justify in a way that really is understood by the broader public why they are not determined to kick Russia off or at any event to suspend its power. So it does seem to me that the suspension possibility, properly managed, has a real potential. Another point about either of these threats, whether efforts to remove altogether or to suspend, may have value. As our permanent representative at the United Nations told me, he was our permanent representative there at a very material time, so I better not name him. But he said, one of the advantages of this type of process is that even if it doesn't succeed, it operates to push Russia. And although we are only thinking in terms of conflict with Russia at the moment, war, Russia needs to be pushed at some stage. And so all these mechanisms, kicking off, suspension, as well as being of potential actual effect, might serve to heap pressure on Russia, who would possibly respond to it at a time when just possibly a response is required. As to the special tribunal, as I've said to my colleagues on this group before, it's a good idea. Whether it's the best idea is something that it's for Ukraine to decide. And that it does have a number of difficulties. America and Great Britain are unlikely ultimately to approve the creation of a tribunal that could be replicated and turned on them for something like Iraq. And it's always this kind of thinking that gets in the way of governments in international criminal law working in the interests of the world as a whole, as opposed to working in their own interests. It was manifest at the end of the First World War, it was manifest at the end of the Second World War. The architecture of international criminal law relating to war has been dominated in interesting and somewhat unknown ways by countries concerned that the law will not be turned on them. So just bear that in mind. And also bear this in mind about the tribunal. If Ukraine is seen to be pushing for a specialist tribunal, which will then involve internationals who will, of course, be willing to corrupt the process, because they're always going to corrupt the process if it's in their interest to do so, to stop the right people being prosecuted, to hold evidence back, stuff like that, it'll be very long. Because whatever lawyers say, it takes ages to set these things up, it takes heaps of money to run them, and their verdicts are then overturned on appeal, argued on appeal, so a 2-year hearing lasts 4 years altogether, or whatever it might be. And remember, at the ICTY, you had trials lasting 10 years. We've got to take all these things into account. And one thing you might want to think about, and it's no more than that, is that given the ICC has jurisdiction over the Ukraine conflict, and the ICC and the states parties of the ICC must recognize the glaring failure to be able to charge aggression, to indict for aggression at the moment, it might just conceivably be a good idea, not so much to focus on doing this yourselves, but to say publicly, it's a disgrace that the ICC doesn't have jurisdiction. The ICC should get on and correct immediately this shortcoming. And if it can't, then the states parties should do what Thomas and Max have spoken of. The states parties should have the initiative to force the change in the Security Council by suspension of Russia. It should be up to them, not to Ukraine. Ukraine should say, there's a world order of criminal law. Why on earth isn't it effective? They've got jurisdiction. Why aren't they doing something to make it more effective? And why just might that be interesting? Well, it might be interesting because if Ukraine has other concerns, for example, not just freezing, but seizing of Russia's assets to restore Ukraine to being a stronger economy when the fighting stops. If you have an international tribunal that it has forced to be set up, and it's going to take 10 years or 7 years to decide, it's going to be very easy for people to say, we'll delay all decisions about freezing and seizing until the determination of that tribunal. But if the efforts to create that tribunal have come from somewhere else, then Ukraine can simply say, oh, we've relied on the world order. The world order isn't serving us, but we've got some perfectly adequate United Nations resolutions, which mean we can get on with our core business. So those are some of the issues to think about. It remains the case that the special tribunal is a good idea, and it has a great support. And I'm not going for 1 minute suggest you don't get on with it. I'm just saying you might like to think about these other things.
Thank you very much, sir. Thomas, I'd love to give you the opportunity to add in or respond if there was anything you want to add there. You covered it?
Only to amplify the point about compensatory mechanisms, because Ukraine and the Ukrainian citizen, Ukrainian businesses have every right under international law to look for full compensation for the harm, the injuries that Russia's aggression has caused. And there is a good rationale to give some priority to that outcome when looking at international law options. And a Security Council approach is what we took in 1991 after Iraq's aggression against Kuwait, and that proved to be quite helpful in setting up a compensatory mechanism in that case. If the Security Council were to become available, if we were to sort of put Russia on mute for a period of time, so to speak, and adopt the necessary resolution on compensatory mechanisms, that would be a great step forward. As Sir Geoffrey pointed out, there may be, as with the criminal procedure, there may be more than one pathway to achieve the outcomes we need. So there are also inquiries going on, efforts going on to put together a multilateral coalition outside the UN or outside the Council at the UN to pursue a compensatory procedure. So that's just by way of amplification of Sir Geoffrey's point.
Great, thank you. I like the concept of Russia on mute. So with a variety of options for changing Russia's role in the UN, whether that's temporary, permanent, on mute, Maxime, a question for you. If Russia is kicked out of the UN, put on mute, whichever way it looks, and there's later a leadership change in Russia, would it be possible for this full membership to be restored? And what do you think the Ukrainian perspective would be on that?
First of all, thanks to my colleagues, I hope that everyone who heard or see us today can clearly understand what differ between good idea and brilliant idea. Brilliant idea can help you to decide few problems at all. So we have one problem with Russian Federation veto in Security Council, another problem with creating a tribunal based on United Nations Charter, and also reparation. Then all three these problems can be solved just with one decision that our initiative group of Civil Hub provides, is to expel Russia from the United Nations at all, and we get a positive result on all three problems. So as for the question of autonomous status of United Nations member to Russian Federation after the end of hostilities, and obviously the change of political regime, the wording of the question should be recognized as incorrect at all. Of course, our initiative group does not in any way object to the Russian Federation's membership in the United Nations, but it should be in accordance with the procedure subject to provision of Article 2, Paragraph 2 and 3 of the Charter regarding refraining from the threats or use of force against other states and respect of international law. So, if Russian Federation want to become a membership of United Nations, so welcome. Even more, I can show you Almaty papers where Ukraine signed the text that we will support them in United Nations. But till they are not a member state of United Nations, we can't do nothing for them at all. If they wanted, they have to show their perspective for Article 2 and all other articles of United Nations Charter. They should go through the procedures every country gone. By the way, in 1992, 3 months after the big geopolitical threat of replacement Russian Federation with Soviet Union, United Nations, former Yugoslavia tried to do the same. And Security Council prepared a special decision numbered 777 and dated 90, as I remember, September of 1992, that, first of all, former Social Federalistic Republic of Yugoslavia has up to the end at all. And all countries that exist in that territory should go through the procedure to become a membership of United Nations. So I think the same question, same idea should be used for Russian Federation. Now we're talking not about the height of their membership. So we're not our question not based on Article 5 or Article 6 of the United Nations Charter. We want just to recover justice in the United Nations at all. And then in Russian Federation, after recognition of United Nations Charter, recognition of international law, stopping aggression, paying restitution, somehow and somewhere, maybe Russian Federation, maybe all other countries that exist in that territory after the war, it also can be, will show that they really want to be a part of United Nations member states in accordance with Article 2. Okay, I think that Ukraine and all other democratic countries in the world will support such country, but not today. Today they can't do it at all, even if we, Ukraine or you, United States or other countries wanted to do it. But it will be illegal because of based on United Nations Charter. Everyone can open this text and just read Articles 2, 3, 4, 23, and 110. So that's the main idea of our initiative group. No words about recovering the membership. The word of becoming a membership. If they want it, so welcome, but according to the international law. And at the same time, there can be no talk of a phantom continuation or inheritance of the former Soviet Union seat in the Security Council as a permanent member. We should talk just about membership of Russian Federation in this organization. Security Council place for former Soviet Union is absolutely one more another question. And this question, as we in our initiative group of Civic Hub, should fulfill by Ukraine as a country of who were among establishing countries of United Nations, who never ever waive a United Nations Charter or international law, who will provide absolutely direct norm of United Nations Charter as a permanent member of Security Council until United Nations and member states will decide what to do with text of article number 23 of this United Nations Charter, because no other countries except Soviet Union wasn't enlisted there. I mean, France, Great Britain, United States, China that become People Republic of China in 1971 based on General Assembly decision. So for today, we as a country, as for my opinion for sure, and my opinion baked by our initiative group members, can fulfill this obligation of permanent member of Security Council until they decide what to do the next.
Great, thank you. I've got one more question for Sir Jeffrey, and then we will turn to audience Q&A. Understanding the extreme nature of the situation with Russia's aggression and the legal precedent that's been set forward, I would like to ask Sir Jeffrey, do you have any concern that this push would set a precedent for malicious actors to push for further reform of the UN? Is it a dangerous path, or is this necessary for international justice, or an isolated situation? I've got you muted one more time.
I don't know if it's a precedent, but I do think that in all the things we're doing at the moment with the United Nations and recognizing the weakness of all the institutions, we should all be looking to improve the institutions. And because if we're not going to improve them, then we're going to abolish them, and it'll be more and more difficult to replace them. The 1948 Declaration of Human Rights could never be signed today. The Genocide Convention could never be signed today because more and more countries are hostile to many of the articles of each of those declarations and the convention. So we must, I think positively. As to reform of the United Nations, as I indicated perhaps a little earlier, I think that the non-specialist citizen all around the world will recognize that they are being failed by this institution. And if we kick off with success or otherwise of Max's idea for removal altogether, or the idea of suspension, if we kick off with those ideas and get public support from them in democratic countries, then we may find that it would be hard for the Permanent Five to resist other reforms, particularly of the Security Council. Although, of course, France and Great Britain, two comparatively small countries now, are going to be hugely resistant to other countries assuming powers there, which they should have. Why is India not on the Security Council? Simply, for example, why haven't we got an African nation there? But can I just add one other point, and slightly off your question, but I think it's very important. Perhaps I should have said this in my first contribution. So far as Ukraine is concerned, by whatever mechanisms, the most important thing for Ukraine at the moment is to have some clear, definitive, authoritative, irreversible decision about moral right and wrong in this conflict. Not in 5 years' time, not in 3 years' time, not in 2 years' time, but now. Why is that important? Because experience does show that that enables countries, when the fighting stops, to move forward. And what we've had so far is a very disappointing failure of prime ministers and presidents all around the world on week 3 or 2 even of February, well, say March of last year, to say in terms, this political leader is a criminal. He is a criminal. And the reason, whatever it is that stops them saying it, is not helping Ukraine. The world needs to know this is a criminal war led by a criminal leader. And the sooner that is said, and preferably endorsed by some effective finding of somebody, I don't care which, the better.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. So you have touched on some of the questions we are getting from our audience. So we have a comment from Adrian Paul, who speaks to what you were just saying, Sir Jeffrey. He says, surely the key question for the UN is, what are we united for and what are we united about? Full-blown invasion of a neighboring country should mean immediate suspension and then expulsion if they do not retreat and agree to make reparations. So not a question there, but I think an important comment that shows where the public is at. So thank you, Adrian. Some more questions from Vadim Tolpeko. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Is a halfway house solution potentially on the cards? Not that Russia would ever accept it, but is it at all conceivable that Russia might get kicked off the United Nations Security Council while staying on as a member? Is there anyone who would like to answer that?
Sure, Shelby. Just very quickly, short answer, yes, that is a possibility because of the way the credentialing procedures can work. If you had the political critical mass of 9 affirmative votes in the council, you could imagine Russia practically no longer participating as a Security Council member, at least pending a reversal of the objection, yet still participating in the assembly, and then also still formalistically speaking, being a member of the organization, even if it's not participating in one or the other organ.
Thank you. A question I'd love to hear anyone answer. What would a UN without Russia look like? Could it make real progress on other political problems, such as in the Middle East, East Asia, Africa, etc.?
Well, not necessarily, I would say, because we have other 4 permanent members with their own views on other issues, and for example, some Middle Eastern countries may not like the position of the United States on Israel, or on the Israeli-Palestinian issue or conflict, or you may have the different views of China on some South Pacific and Eastern Asia issues. But let me say that I don't think that it's realistic to imagine that the United Nations in general can be reformed without without touching the key issues, and the key issues are first the composition of the UN Security Council, and the second is the right of veto, as is. And but I think that now we have the unique opportunity, if we start the process of kicking Russia out of the United Nations, this may launch or speed up the whole process of the UN Security Council reform. Because here comes issues of, for example, how we can have the new permanent members of the council, like Japan or Germany or Brazil or India. The world is very different from 1945. This organization is, as I used to say, non-reformable because it's too old, it's too bureaucratic. It cannot play at least the political role. The UN turned into the pure distributor of funds, which can be done even without the United Nations. It's a huge bureaucracy. And I fully agree with Sir Jeffrey, who says that the public opinion, if you ask people in the streets in any country of the world about the UN, you can hardly hear the positive views of the United Nations, even against the background that UN is helping a lot to many developing countries, peacekeeping operations, humanitarian assistance, economic, financial assistance. But as I already said, we should not overestimate the role of the UN as it exists out of this planet. It exists on the funds which are being provided by the UN member states. And by the way, probably, this is not a very popular thesis, which I'm going to say, and many people will not like it, but just imagine 80% of the annual UN budget is being spent for salaries for the UN staff. 80%, 80. The biannual budget of the UN, if I remember correctly, is something like $8 billion. It's not a lot of money, but 80% of this money biannually is being spent only to pay salaries to the UN staff. I don't think that this is the best way to spend the money which are paid by the UN member states.
Thank you very much.
I can add just a few words
Okay.
about people throughout the world who, as a rule, and clearly understand this position, doesn't understand what exact UN did or will do for keeping peace throughout the world. I would say that let's give United Nations an opportunity to act according and based on the Charter. It's possible, absolutely, even without any change for this Charter. You can see South Korea case. This country would never exist if United Nations would make a decision in 1915, in early 50s, and this country still exists and exists very well, as I understand from all my colleagues who visited this country. Other question with Iraq in 1991. What happened with Kuwait if United Nations doesn't exist at all, or doesn't use their opportunities based on UN Charter? Nowadays, we speak about not to replace United Nations with some other organization. We speak about to give a United Nations an opportunity to act based on its own charter. What to do to avoid one country that never legally become a member, but for many, many times illegally use a so-called veto right in United Nations Security Council to provide zero responsibility for itself and its clients. We all knew that countries from Africa, Asia, etc., that use this umbrella of Russian Federation veto and then support this country anyway. And so I would rather say about even not some kind of renewal of United Nations, but just for giving this organization right and real opportunity to act at all.
Thank you very much. As we've mentioned other nations and regions in the world, Alexei, there's a question for you. What efforts is Ukraine making to gain allies on this question and others in the global south? Are there any dialogues ongoing between Ukrainian members of parliaments and MPs in the global south?
Let me say very, very good questions. And I want to say, first of all, about our negotiations with Western countries, because it's more interesting to understand of the deep reasons why this clear, understandable issue not eliminated for this time. As we know, as we remember, the UN has created by the victors of the World War II, in fact, to control over the rest world the strongest states by that era. But when USSR collapsed, nobody from that countries don't have to change these world rules, this state of affairs for all, and that's why they providing tacit consent for the UN Secretariat to violate the UN Charter and present Russia as the USSR. But now time changed all that countries, and some weak countries stay more stronger, more powerful with nuclear weapon, and these countries very support Ukrainian initiative to change some rules, some state of the UN Security Council, and we have many allies among newly developed countries. But we also meet those who are worried about protecting their current influence over the UN. They fear that the review of the composition of the Security Council may not end with the expulsion or replacement of only the Russian Federation. But we understand these fears and therefore suggest a safe alternative, not to exclude Russia, but to acknowledge that she illegitimate in the UN because of decisions of 1991, because of mistake of Secretary General of that time. And it's not the reform of UN. We provide a rapid technical solution to a specific problem, to remove of a terrorist, a fascist state from the Security Council. And that's all. We don't want the reform, and the fears of our Western partners it's not the place for these fears.
I can add a few words to Alexei's speech. Alexei doesn't spoke about his beautiful, marvelous work with Global South. A few months ago, it was started with, as I remember, Parliament Assembly in Africa, yeah? And as Alexei told us, a few countries, African countries, come to Ukrainian delegation just to tell that Ukrainian delegation was the first delegation that ever even tried to hear their needs. Yes, Alexei?
Yes, Maxim, you are absolutely right. It's a very big problem that previous cadences of parliament, of government, don't take many efforts to make the dialogue with Global South and the Latin countries and that very far countries from Ukraine. And many of them even don't know that Ukraine, the independent state, and that Ukraine is not Russia or some Soviet country, you know. And now when our parliamentarians through the cross-parliament diplomacy are working hardly in the Africa countries, in the Asia and Latin countries, we see the results, and we can even count these results on the votings on the UN General Assembly. When we see the increasing of positive voices and decreasing of neutral or negative voices for the Ukrainian resolutions.
Excellent, thank you. It's very interesting to hear about that. Actually, another question for you, Alexei, and Ambassador Yelchenko, you might want to jump in. Moderator's prerogative. This is my question, not from the audience, but I've heard from some experts and those that work closely with the UN that they think the most recent UN General Assembly vote is the highest threshold Ukraine will get, and that support will continue to decline. It seems like you're saying the opposite. What do you think about that statement?
Well, I think that it's not totally right, because 141 votes. Yes, you may say there's -2 votes compared to 1-year-old resolution, but there were also 143 votes for another resolution. I don't remember exactly. I think it was about the expelling Russia from the UN Council for Human Rights or something regarding Crimea. So we have this more or less stable majority of 140 plus minus 2-3 votes. What is the most important is that this is 2/3 plus. So we may rely on this number of votes in case we go for the General Assembly resolution on the expulsion of Russia, or For example, well, this is the issue which was not mentioned today, but I would like to add that there is another possibility, the option number 5, to start the process of expelling Russia from the legal, well, asking the legal opinion of the International Court of Justice on the issue. This is something which was done several times in the past, not always successfully. But if you formulate the question purely legally without any, political connotations, mentioning the decisions of 1991, Almaty Declaration, other things. By the way, you can also mention the issue or ask the International Court of Justice whether the term continuation is right, because there is a term of succession, if I remember correctly, but Russia pretends to be the continuing state of the former Soviet Union, which does not exist in a way in the international law. So you may ask a number of questions from the International Court, adding to that the final question of whether Russia can be considered as a legal successor of the former Soviet Union, and this may lay some ground for any future exercise, be it another resolution by the General Assembly or the Credentials Committee decision, and so on and so forth. So coming back to the question, I don't think that we have any negative tendency in the General Assembly. As I said, we have this 140 plus minus, which is a good figure, a good number, and I don't think that Russia would ever be able to lessen this number. What is even more important is that you have only 5 to 7 states which always vote against. And this number will never grow because Russia exhausted its, the camp of its supporters. Even countries like Cuba or Venezuela or Bolivia, which used to be among the initial 11, 15, 17, which always voted against Ukraine, starting from 2014, they are either abstaining or not participating. So we used to have 5 countries, Russia plus 4. Now we have Russia plus 6, 7 altogether, and I don't think that they could ever be able to find even one more country, more than that. 5 plus 2, what is plus 2? This is Mali and Nicaragua. I don't think that these countries are really having their, final position written in the stone. This is a very this is simply because these 2 countries are 100% dependable or dependent on Russia militarily, financially, economically, and so on. So I'm pretty positive on that.
Thank you. Alexei, did you want to join?
Let me a little bit not agree with Vladimir, because when we discuss with other colleagues from African countries, especially from African countries, we see the huge influence of Russian propaganda about the imperialism and neo-colonialism of Western countries, that they providing, as Russia says, to Ukraine and South Europe. But when we demonstrate that the nature of Russian aggression is neo-imperialistic and neo-colonialistic, and when these African countries understand this, they change their view on this thing, because the cultural and some psychological reasons of decision of African leaders very dependent of these things, of neo-colonialism and neo-imperialism policy of the states.
I should rather add just few words. You should understand clearly that nobody will support Goliath while David are preparing to throw its sling at all. So if our president will bring the draft resolution to General Assembly to expel Russian Federation at all with its fake membership, I don't think that lots of countries will back Russia independently, or they have strong economy contracts with Russia, or they have different kind of understanding of enemies in the West, doesn't matter. So we can do it, it can be done, and it will be done in the nearest future at all. It's my own private opinion. It's opinion of our initiative group members, and I hope it will be opinion of all free countries of the world.
Maxime, that is an excellent note to end on. Thank you so much for that. Thank you to all of our panelists for your generosity with your time, and thank you to our audience. You gave me a lot of questions, so I think we'll need to do future discussions. To everyone that's watched us, stay tuned for more Atlantic Council programming on Ukraine and future events, and thank you so much.